All right, I'd like to welcome everybody to this panel session on freight system impacts resulting from COVID-19. We have with us today three industry experts who are representing different aspects of our freight system. Of course, as we all know, COVID-19 has had a pretty dramatic impact upon a lot of things related to transportation and the way we live, but especially upon how we move freight, how products are moved from production to market. And the people that we have with us today are going to be able to provide some insight into how it's impacted those specific industries, and especially for industries that are prominent here in the Pacific Northwest. And so the speakers that we have with us today, I'm going to make the introductions now, and then each of them will give their talk, and we will hold the questions and kind of the dialogue toward the end of the session so that we'll certainly allocate enough time for those questions at the end. We have with us today Ranie Haas. She's the Director of Regulatory and Industry Affairs for the Washington State Tree Fruit Association. Of course, the tree fruit industry is a very large and prominent aspect of our economy here in the Pacific Northwest, not just in the state of Washington, but across the states of Washington, Oregon, even California. So she'll be speaking first. Then we have Michelle Hennings, who's the Executive Director of the Washington Association of Wheat Growers. And of course, grain production, wheat production specifically, is also one of the key economic sectors in the state of Washington. And then the last speaker is Aleksandra Maguire. She's the Associate Director of Consulting and Analysis for the Freight Transportation part of IHS Markit, which is a global commodities consulting firm, mostly focused on freight research. With that, we can begin now with Ranie. And Ranie, I'll move the controls to you. You can turn on your video, and I'll turn mine off for now.
Well, again, thank you, Eric, for the invitation to sit on this panel today. My name is Ranie Haas. I'm with the Washington State Tree Fruit Association, and we represent growers and packers and shippers of tree fruit, namely apples, pears, and cherries. So I'm going to go ahead and dive right into my talk here today. Two of the major challenges that arose due to COVID-19 was for the tree fruit industry was getting our product directly to market successfully. And we also had issues with managing and supplying our workforce. So it's fair to say that we as tree fruit we were less affected, if you will, than maybe some of the other commodities, just because a large share of our product went to supermarket outlets that remained open. And so unlike, for example, French fries, potato industry, that they saw a big chunk of their business go away because some of the potato industry customers were shut down, and ours were not, because a lot of their product was packaged more so for institutional use. They had a big box of French fries that was going to McDonald's, let's say, and we had a standard 40-pound box of apples that was going to a supermarket, and that can be opened by a food service rep or a food service person, or just at the grocery store. So we didn't have the same problems with packaging, and it was a benefit to us. And we just had a little better position with our product. So, but one of the major hurdles we did have as an industry was moving our product successfully to market. We had fluctuating demand, truck availability, and overburdened distribution centers. And I'll start with fluctuating demand. We're usually set up to have a fairly consistent week-to-week shipment to keep supermarkets supplied. Well, when COVID happened, you saw a lot of industries, not just tree fruit, when the lockdown orders came into play, everyone ran to the grocery store, stocked up in desperate need, and then they all went home and stayed home for 2 weeks. So you saw this huge pull of product, and then so you had massive demand, and then everybody stayed home for 2 weeks. So it was a lull, and then again massive demand, and then you had another stall. So it was just a huge wave ripple effect, and that was a huge challenge for us to navigate through. And we also saw truck availability and distribution systems being disrupted, and people and businesses were not being able to get their orders filled because a lot of wholesaler distributors were just disrupted. It was sort of this chain reaction, and we saw some strange situations, just like here in the Yakima area. The schools were wanting to get apples for their lunch to go programs that they had, boxes of lunch that they were sending out to the kids. And we would get some customers or schools saying, we didn't get our boxes of apples. So the distributors were just, like I said, were disrupted. And so we had to create this direct contact between some of the shippers and the schools. So that was just another issue to navigate through. And same thing with our exports, and the transportation system was disrupted, and it caused all sorts of problems. And that was caused both by the logistics of moving product through the ports, and when you might have a COVID infected employee and people were shutting down or threatening to shut down, and domestic retailers were being closed that were not essential. Therefore, there was no restocking of goods that were coming over from Asia. Therefore, orders stopped or were canceled. Therefore, ships were not coming to be filled with our product to go back the other direction. So our transportation capacity was just minimized. So also some of the customers or consumers in overseas markets might not have had that same benefit like the US government did. They, gave out some extra monies and stimuli and such. So there was some great curtailing of shopping for some of those overseas consumers. And so you saw, because of the overall economy being dampened and disrupted, you saw less transportation capacity. And just a quick note, the Northwest Seaport Alliance, their gateway, experienced a total of 58 blank sailings up to the month of August of this year. So that 58 is the total number of blank sailings that they had in all of 2019. So again, less transportation capacity. The net result on exports was we normally export 32+% of our entire apple crop, and this year it was 27%. So that's a significant decline, and that 5% is not exported, so that stays here domestically, and that affects the pricing. So another problem that we had due to COVID-19. Also, managing and supplying our workforce was a huge hurdle for us. We as an industry also had to deal with how we were going to adapt our warehouses and our orchards to protect workers during this COVID environment. And you couldn't always get the supplies that you needed to, such as masks and sanitizer and such. So our members were trying to get these supplies that they needed to modify their operations while they were up and running. So it was kind of doing everything on the fly. So that was a huge challenge for us. For example, we also, some of our members would order masks and be have an order in and be told that they were going to be getting masks in 2 weeks, and then 2 weeks turned into a month, and then a month turned into 2 months. So that was very difficult for them, and because they wanted to be assuring their workforce and keeping their workforce safe. So we also had members that were told that they needed to make modifications to their packing lines, such as putting up barriers in between workstations. And trying to do that on a fixed packing line is very difficult, but the ingenuity of our members was really, really impressive. So they needed to put up these barriers, and it was a challenge to find the plexiglass and plastic to frame up to make a barrier in between these workstations. So again, their ingenuity is out of this world. I was actually part of a team. We partnered with the Yakima County Health District and went into some of the packing houses just to give them some ideas of what they might be able to do better, or just to take their ideas and pass on the word to maybe another warehouse that could use their modification ideas as well. So it was really fun being a part of, I use the word lightly, fun, but it was really rewarding to be a part of that team. They also couldn't get hand sanitizer or cleaning products in the volumes that they needed them. And so again, they were trying to do this and doing this all while the rules were being changed on a daily basis or an hourly basis. So it was, it's been a crazy world, I know, for everybody. But while they were trying to modify their operations and keep them up and running, they also had workers, that were, can I say, anxious or concerned for their safety, and rightly so. And some who were just not thrilled to be deemed essential. And if you're deemed not essential, then you are were able to go home and to collect unemployment and $600 of extra money. So that led to the claims of, well, can I get hazard pay? Not because necessarily there was a belief that they were going to be at risk or anything. They were more, if everyone else gets to stay home and collect money, why can't I? Or why can't I get extra money since I'm going to work? So that was a perception problem that hit hard to our industry. So we were trying to do everything we could to keep our employees safe and reassure them. And the perception was that we were just not doing enough, because otherwise, why would they walk off the job? And it would be fair to say that we also had members that had workers that did walk off the job, and it was more so financial. So it would be fair to say that we could protect, if they were members having these workers go and protest and ask for more money. They, rightly so, that created this world that we had to start doing a lot more of just negotiation, and it was for safety reasons and just good communication. We wanted to make sure that these workers felt safe and felt as though that they were being appreciated and they were in a healthy place. So with that, I conclude that while our industry and they were attempting to do all the things that we could to protect our workforce, we had a challenging sales environment and working through getting our products successfully to market. Washington State and our industry while it was confusing and it was disruptive, I believe we did a really good job with responding, and we didn't have as severe problems as we potentially could have. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Eric.
Thank you, Ranie. It's very good. So I will also say that if any of the participants have questions, you're free to submit those either in the chat or in the Q&A. I'm going to be screening those, and then of course at the end of the session we'll open up a dialogue and we can address some of the questions that panel or people that present for the panelists. Our next speaker is Michelle Hennings with the Washington Association of Wheat Growers, and I'll turn it over to you, Michelle.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Hennings. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington Association of Wheat Growers. We are a member organization of approximately 1,800 members throughout Washington State, and we lobby on behalf of our farmers. We also partner with the Washington Grain Commission through research, education, and transportation. We also provide education to our farmers as well. So I'm going to try to share my screen here. I have a PowerPoint, so bear with me one moment. I'm going to try to, I hope everybody can see my screen. If not, please let me know. Can everyone see that?
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, thank you.
See you.
Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is our PNW wheat export destinations. We produce 165.6 million bushels, which is about 4.5 million metric tons of wheat in the year of 2020. We planted about 2.3 million acres, and while farmers have a rotation, we don't have the ability to plant other cash crops like corn or soy. So our acreage really stays fairly consistent. We're a big export commodity. We export between 85 to 90% of our crop every year, with most of the wheat going to Asia. Our top markets are the Philippines, South Korea, Japan, and Indonesia. I want to talk about China a little bit because COVID did impact with China. When January Phase 1 agreement was put into place and it was slow to get off the ground. China's still behind on what they committed for purchases, and this has been blamed mostly on COVID. China currently is playing catch up, which is causing capacity issues at elevators with soy and corn, eating up the rail capacity as well. China is currently third for wheat in the US as of today. Philippines is the first, and Mexico is the second. And as I said before, for Washington State, Philippines, Korea, Japan, and Indonesia are the order that we are now our trading partners. No soft white wheat has been purchased by China yet. So we have had a fluctuation of, it was an emerging market for us, and now we have been at zero for quite some time. So we're hoping to see some tenders come through soon, hopefully. The Philippines is actually up 42% in their purchases of US or the PNW grain or US grain. So the South Asia is seeing a lot of gains right now. I would say Japan is a slight concern right now. They're down 9%, which is COVID related. They're not being able to go out and eat, and customer demand is dropping and impacting consumption. Taiwan is down 20% from last year. So there are some examples of, we really heavily rely on our export markets for our commodity. And so we are continually monitoring them very closely on how COVID is impacting their country, currently and into the future. There are some numbers we don't have right now because it seems like it's just doing the trickle effect right now. So, but this is one of our top concerns for wheat growers in Washington State. Okay, next slide. I thought I would put this up here. This is a really great slide. It's Washington Wheat Critical Infrastructure System. And so this shows you everything that comes back to the center circle, the producer and the farmer. You know, we have containers, barges, rail, pipelines, ship. I mean, even the pipeline affects us, shipping, finance, and transaction. You can see our inputs and our equipment and our financials come down, and everything circles back to the producer. It will always affect the farmer. And over on the right-hand side, you can see the critical infrastructure we have down to our universities, fields, and labs, you know, our water, and then our specific vulnerabilities over there that have, you know, the river, which is the Federal Snake Columbia River system. Our dams are, the dams are a big part of our infrastructure. They're consistently being attacked by those who feel we shouldn't have dams. You know, our rail, we have, you know, different infrastructure challenges there. Short line rail, our truck, and all the way down to, you know, the weather. We can't predict the weather. None of the commodities can. We're in Eastern Washington, a lot of dry land. We have some irrigation, but we are a big dry land state for wheat. And so that means that we rely on the weather for our rain and our water. And if we have any impacts there, it can be devastating sometimes to farmers. All arrows point to the farmer. Any disruption in anything along this supply chain is going to have an impact on our farmers. Transportation. This is our critical infrastructure. Our inputs are fertilizer, barge, truck, rail, fuel, seed, equipment. We use roads for trucks, rivers for the barges, and we use class 1 short line rail, and then ocean freight. So Washington farmers are lucky to have these modes of transportation. Disruption of one can be accommodated by the other. Dam maintenance versus rail delays in the winter. These are short-term fixes, but the cost can be maintained to extend what is planned. Transportation disruptions we saw due to COVID was in our ports. There was a first disruption at the Port of Houston for the US, and it was shut down for 24 hours during early COVID. And this actually started a conversation with all the other ports so that they were able to come up with preventative measures if they were, you know, if this situation happens. So then in the PNW, we did have UGC, one of the companies, did shut down for a day, but there was minimal impact to our exporting. So we did not see any type of big impact there. They handled it very well and got back to operating as soon as they could. The trucks, they did have to do some contactless grain delivery, which was implemented at the elevators. So this may have caused some investment in more digital invoicing, you know, more of the digital world for some of the companies. Rivers, we didn't see any major impacts with COVID on the barge system, but there was a backup for a day when UGC was shut down. Rail with China, like I said before, their purchasing of more soy and corn has impacted our elevator space and rail car availability. And for wheat, that's been really challenging. It has always been challenging to kind of get rail to where it needs to be, but with all the purchases from China recently has really impacted us. And as you can see, 60% of our wheat is transported by barge, 3% by truck, and 37% by rail. And we need all these modes of transportation to make sure that we are reliable for our trading partners and getting our product to market in a timely fashion. Social distancing, farmers' response to COVID-19. Initially, agriculture was deemed essential, and there were not in the beginning protocols that were put into place for COVID. In June, the governor of Washington State decided to issue some guidance rules for the ag industry in regard to social distancing. His proclamation was a one-size-fits-all. And we are not a one size fits all, and I'll give you an example. Labor varies through all commodities. The average labor for wheat is probably 3 to 5 employees out in the field at a time, and among hundreds of acres that they're harvesting in one day. And compared to fruit, tree fruit, or, where they have, multiple workers in an area, we have a little bit of a different situation there. So not one size fits all for all commodities. And most of our employees are family members tied to that family farm. It did put some stress on the wheat growers because they did put this into place in June. That's before harvest. So everyone was trying to rush around and try to find the PPE material, your masks, your hand sanitizers. We also did write a letter to the governor's office in regard to hand washing stations. My next photo I'm going to show you, you can see why a hand washing station could be very, my next two photos, but it could be very challenging for wheat growers as we're not all in one area at the same time. So I'm going to move on to the next. So this is a photo of how we harvest wheat. And as you can see there's 3 different combines here. They're spread very far apart. There's a tractor with 1 person. Each combine has 1 person in it running and operating the machinery. And then there's a truck driver probably at the end of the field by that road, and we can't quite see him. But this shows you how segregated we already are. And we already are pretty much, so some of these guidance rules that, oh, I'm sorry, how do I go back? Shoot, there we go. Some of these rules that the governor put in place were very challenging for us. And of course, all the wheat growers wanted to comply. So we did see kind of some stress there out in the countryside trying to get that to work. Here's a picture of the inside of it. It's not a very good picture, but inside of a combine. And so you can see, you can't put a hand washing station in there really. I mean, you can have a hand sanitizer and masks, in which that's kind of how they handle that situation. There's just not a lot of room for that. So getting down to the overall concern, we did a survey of our farmers. We did 2 surveys. We did one when COVID first hit, and then we did one 3 months later. And as you can see, their concern is from high to moderate. Their concern, farmers' overall concern for COVID is, according to the survey of membership, it's caused uncertainty out in the countryside and more stress. Sorry, I lost my spot. When we talk about price, the farmers, their number one issue was trade and price uncertainty. Price right now is $5.55 and an average of $5.75 at Portland. During harvest, our price went all the way down to the high $4, and break even for wheat is $6.50. We've been battling price for quite some time, but with COVID, it did not help our price any. Farmers' concern was the economy and what it will do to price. Another few items that they were really concerned about was delay with suppliers, access to parts. Freight on the supplies were very delayed during COVID. Planning ahead for seed and fertilizer purchases, especially those manufactured overseas, was a concern, and also increased taxes due to the state deficit. Wheat farmers are price takers and cannot pass excess cost on to consumers like certain commodities. So when their costs increase, it hits their bottom line. They cannot sell their product for more in a store. We are more of a, we're a different commodity that way. Let's see. Here is, I'm going to talk a little bit about what wheat farmers have received for some government assistance during COVID. The federal government provided assistance to agricultural through a program called the Coronavirus Food Assistance Program. White wheat did not make the first round. Due to already low prices, the government felt wheat wasn't really affected to the 5% that they thought we did. But they only took a snapshot of 2 different weeks in there. They didn't take the whole time period. So during this process, when we didn't make that first cut, there was just 2 or 3 wheat classes that made it, but not the majority of wheat, like white wheat did not make the cut. So what we did is we provided comments to the government on, why did you only take 2 snapshots? If you look at the whole picture, we were actually at an 8% decrease instead of what they were saying we were affected 5%. And so then they went to reassess the CFAP 2, and all wheat got into the program, which is a very good benefit for the farmers to help them through these uncertainty, low prices in trade. As you can see, we kind of showed you in Washington so far, because they have through December to sign up, but these are what the CFAP payments have gone out. I cannot think of one commodity that's probably not in it. I'm sure there's maybe 1 or 2, but they really did unite agriculture so that everyone that was affected could, get assistance from the federal government. Now at the state level, they had the Paycheck Protection Program. This was okay. Some applied, some didn't. You had the rules to be able to actually get that funding were difficult for some farmers to be able to make. So I didn't see, I would say probably 40% of farmers were able to take part in that program. And then they had some SVS loans at the federal level as well. So overall, compared to some commodities such as tree fruit and potatoes, wheat had less impact of COVID related issues. The issue we have been really monitoring is our uncertainty that lies with trade and price, where we are consistently monitoring our trading partners. High cost of inputs has a big impact also on our farmers. So if equipment, fuel, seed and fertilizer costs go up, then that hits the grower's bottom line, and that has a big impact on their bottom line when price is low. We've also seen new farmers that were trying to start farming basically made a choice not to, and we do have some farmers that are going out of business and selling their land as well, which is very unfortunate. So I hope this is helpful, and I can take questions, but I thank you for having me on this panel, and so I look forward to any questions.
Thanks, Michelle. Very good information. So we're going to move ahead. We're going to hold questions until all the panelists have spoken, and then we'll open it up for questions at the end. Next, we have Aleksandra Maguire. She's the Associate Director of Consulting with IHS Markit. And I will hand it over to you, Aleksandra.
Thank you, Eric. Let me share my slides too. Yep. Just make that presentation mode. All right. So basically what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of a broader view. So I'll start with the economy and go down to the global and then US, and then go down to sort of show you what's been going on and what we're forecasting, and further go into the specifics, that implications that has on the agriculture, and specifically with the COVID implications. So what we're seeing here is a chart. It's our most recent October forecast for GDP and industrial production. And it's also showing the historical information, and in which you can see sort of comparison with the 2008-2009 recession for both GDP and industrial production. In this case, you can see that in 2020, due to COVID, we have seen big drop in both GDP and industrial production, even higher with the industrial production than the GDP, but not as high for industrial production as it was in the big recession 2009. So after all this drop, we are seeing in 2021 an increase. Basically the drop, I think the current forecast is that the drop into 2020 will be 4.5% for GDP, but that will return in about 4.4% in 2021 and then slowly decline and slowly even out and be about 3%, 3.5% thereafter. Same for industrial production, although industrial production will increase a little bit more in 2021. And this is mostly due to the assumption that we have the pre-COVID, or that we will be back to the sort of normal in the middle of 2021, and that vaccine will be available at that time frame. Most of the growth, most of the drops really, as you can see here with industrial production, it's not showing agriculture and mining, but it is showing the service and manufacturing industry. And I'll show you that more in the next slide where, well, not this slide, the next slide after this, but I'll talk about this as well, because this is also very important. Imports and exports have declined significantly in 2020. And when you compare that to 2009 recession, it's even bigger drop in both imports and exports. And what we're forecasting in 2021 is a big rebound for both imports and exports. Exports are mostly driven by the favorable dollar, and the imports are driven by the demand in the US, and obviously exports are driven by the foreign demand. What I wanted to talk to you about is this is our PMI index, and it's just the current data, doesn't have a forecast. PMI is a purchasing manager index, and this is the global purchasing manager index, and it's showing the services and manufacturing output, service business activity. And you can see that the huge drop in the services industry due to COVID implications was even higher than the manufacturing output drop. That is because the service industry has been hurt because of the lockdowns, and you have the restaurants, hotels, cruise, and all of that stuff being shut down for a long time. But what we're seeing now is a slow rebound, and actually a bigger rebound in manufacturing in 2020 than we had in 2019. And also an increase and slow drop now in services industries. And what we're seeing is that the service industries is dependent more on face-to-face, and the social distancing is really much harder to apply in the services than it is in manufacturing, where you have more option to have that social distancing. Next slide, I'll just basically talk about sort of the intro that the next slides are going to have on the agriculture industry implications. So some of the things that we're seeing is the much more automation and robotics and new technologies to sort of replace the low-wage labor that we're seeing in the agriculture industry, especially in fruits and vegetables and meat processing. And also the other thing that's happening is that there's a gene editing to increase the productivities and reduce the cost, and to make basically to meet the demands for this industry. Also, some of the things that, one of the biggest things we've seen is that more foods has been consumed at home than it's been delivered to the restaurants because they were shut down, and this trend continues. And in the short term, it's going to continue as well. Another thing that was very evident is that the supply chains were impacted hard, and that there was a lot of companies didn't have a good view of the overall supply chain and not good risk management. And it was hard to get alternative sources, even if they had good plans in place. So that was something that was impacted greatly. And that's something that, you know, every company needs to have a good risk management. It needs to have a good view of their supply chain. And global trade negotiations, that's a big one. And, you know, there needs to be a lot of preparations in that. And this is still going to continue. So now I'm going to go into a little bit on the U.S. supply chain and sort of talk about U.S. crop and agriculture implications. So basically, this slide basically is showing, and it doesn't show all the months yet. This data has been updated slightly, but basically it shows the U.S. crop production for major crop for barley, corn, wheat, soybeans, and oats, showing surplus areas and deficit areas. Basically, what this shows is that the surplus areas will produce enough of crops and that the deficit areas will have enough to satisfy their demand for either the meat processing, meat feeding, sorry, industry, or for crushing, or for ethanol production. And that surplus areas will have enough crop produced in the US to satisfy the domestic demand. When you look at the US crop exports, this chart is updated recently, but basically we're showing that about 6 billion bushels available for export for all the grains. And this is shown by the port and by the region. And as evident, the Central Gulf area has the biggest share of all the exports. And the Pacific Northwest area with the Columbia River and Puget Sound showing there with the gray line and the blue line. The volumes there have been increasing, and this is mostly corn and soybeans. This chart basically shows the 2019-2020 versus 2020-21 sort of share of exports by grain category. And soybeans and corn are forecasted to increase, where wheat is going to remain sort of stable, but will not increase greatly. The other categories are barely visible on this chart. Next slide, and basically this talks about how basically shows the index for tonnage and tonnage index for the covered hopper barge. There is enough available capacity on the barge, the overall barge market in the US to handle the capacity, and both for domestic production, domestic consumption, and exports. And conditions for navigation have been sort of pretty favorable and decent. And the railroads have, due to COVID-19, there has been drop in a lot of commodities. Coal has dropped, autos has dropped, the containers or consumer goods has dropped, but grain is forecasted to increase both for the domestic and for US and for the export. And one other thing that's shown on this chart is that there's enough for both surplus and a deficit. And one other thing that's happening is because there's less carloads, the velocity or speed of train has increased slightly, and we think that railroads are going to be positioned well in overall US to be able to ship grains. This chart is sort of looking back on what has happened in 2019 and 2020. This is from our Commodities at Sea service, and it shows exports from US to China by type of grain. In 2019, soybeans have dominated the export market to China. And in 2020, that mix has changed a little bit. And please bear in mind, this is January to August data. And we see the increase in wheat, slightly, corn, and sorghum. This is mainly due to two things. Last year, due to trade implications, there has been stockpiling for soybeans and corn. And then also this year, we're seeing shutdown, and also we're seeing exports from Brazil to China growing due to the favorable currency in Brazil. But as you've seen in the previous charts, we're forecasting the soybeans and corn to increase this year. And this is the final slide, just basically talking about overall implications of COVID-19 on agriculture and supply and the food industry. As I mentioned previously, there has been an increase of food consumption or agricultural product consumption at home, and sort of shorter term of 1 year, we expect this to continue, and we're seeing that certain geographies we have as much as 25% of dislocation of shipping and supply chain to direct to consumer versus direct to the restaurants and business. And labor disruptions, especially in meat industry and farming industry, have been impacted. There've been biggest failure in the system, but then also supply chain disruptions of shipping meat products as well as the farm products have been impacted as well. And as I mentioned previously, companies and organizations need to have better visibility of their supply chain, and they need to be able to plan for alternative supply sources. And we're seeing still growth, and growth will continue for direct-to-consumer shipping channels. And again, I'll mention that automation is very important, especially going to become important after what has happened with COVID-19, and a lot more automation is going to be happening on a plant level. This is all for me today, so please open it up to questions.
Very good, Aleksandra. If any of the participants have questions, feel free to submit those. I have several questions just to kick things off. The first one, I guess, is for Michelle. Michelle, you were talking about how that because of heavy soybean and corn exports, that it impacted rail capacity for wheat movements. I guess, where did you notice that? Was it in, that's mostly, I guess, for like capacity for corn and soybeans being exported out of P&W, that's utilizing capacity out here in the Pacific Northwest that wheat guys would be using. Was it?
Right. Rail comes from the Midwest as well. So what we're seeing, yeah, they're exporting through our ports. So what we're seeing is that, since China's trying to meet their phase 1 requirements or agreement, that, now they're buying a lot of corn and soy compared to wheat. And so it's just difficult. It's always been difficult for wheat because we're a smaller commodity to be able to get rail cars. And then we're also seeing elevator capacity. So an issue because
So that was my question. Was it increased rates that shippers and the wheat shippers out here are faced, or just access to?
It's access. It's pretty much access right now because we have all our modes of transportation. If we were to lose one of those modes of transportation, such as our barge system, our rates would go through the roof for rail, vice versa. So it's really, really important for us to have all those modes of transportation in order to keep the costs down for the farmers, and also to be able to get our product to market, in an efficient manner. Because we lose one of those, we could become unreliable, which would not be good for our export markets.
So one follow-up to you also, Michelle. You earlier in your talk, you said that the markets, the impacts kind of vary depending upon the export market in terms of the impact. But were those impacts primarily related to the COVID impacts in those export markets, or in transportation services getting to those markets?
So Japan is actually within Japan because they're also going through COVID. So like, for instance, they're down 9% currently. And it is due to COVID, and the consumer is consuming less. So the consumer demand is lower because they're not going out to restaurants. I'm really surprised at the Philippines right now. We're up over 40%. So that is a really good thing for us because that's our #1 market. But that we are keeping, an eye on the areas around Japan, it seems.
So Ranie, you talked about, of course, also had different impacts upon your export markets. But I guess looking more long-term, like in the future, do you see these impacts having more longer-term impacts in terms of like how the tree fruit industry positions their products, meaning maybe more ready-serve type packaging, or is it going to have those kind of like more longer-term impacts to the tree fruit industry, or is this mostly just short-term? Fresh market still going to be fresh market? Do you have any insight?
I think not knowing, not having the crystal ball, but I think that this, once things get leveled out with COVID, I think our exports will go back up. And I think that, you know, we've stayed pretty consistent with 32% over the last few years of export for our apple crop. So I think that that's going to just, once we hit that heading back up spot, I think that we'll be exporting back up to our normal capacity. So,
but no longer term in terms of the way we deliver our products, since, you know, consumers are eating more at home or into at least, you know, kind of pre-prepared kind of stuff. You still see those in terms of the actual product being delivered being consistent the way it was in the past?
I believe so. That's, yeah.
So Aleksandra, that one chart that you had up that had the, I think it was IHS's market forecast on GDP and going forward coming out of COVID, it looked like it bounced right back up there to, like, I think you said somewhere between 3 and 4% starting in 2021, I believe. What is that mostly predicated on? That seems like a big response back in terms of GDP. Is that was a global number? That's a global number that you had? Or is that US?
Let me look, sorry. I know I was bouncing back and forth, global or not. Yes, this is, yes, it is a global number. So yeah, the you know, basically the biggest increase, and some of this is due to the assumption that we'll be back to sort of normal or at the middle of 2021 with vaccine available, and that is a big assumption that's during our forecasts. And we are seeing growth in China mostly, which is already happening. They're surpassing expectations, and growth in manufacturing in China especially. We are seeing sort of slowdown in Europe. US will be back to sort of pre-COVID levels, but then it will drop. But the biggest growth really is in China. And you know, there is a huge manufacturing part of the Chinese economy that we see growing still. That's all I read so far that I know about global economy. I'll be happy to cover more if you need to.
So there was a recent article in the Economist talking about what will happen going forward. And for those countries and places in the world where they felt like they had very good control of COVID, China being one of them, at least now, it may not always stay that way, but at least now they felt like those countries that had the best job of controlling it, their economies were going to do the best job of coming out of it faster and quicker, and it's something that they're going to have to deal with for a long time. But as a result, the prediction was that these markets are going to grow at different rates based upon how well they control it. And the two markets that they had kind of low expectations on is the European market and the US market, mostly because they've done such a poor job of controlling COVID. But yet there are some markets in Asia where they have done, where they've had stricter controls. And of course, so I guess my question is to you, Aleksandra, what information does IHS Markit have in terms of, like, do you feel the same way? Do you feel like that's going to be kind of like the leading indicator? Or
No, absolutely, yeah. And we're specifically seeing that in Europe and Eurozone, they're struggling. You're seeing a lot more And this, you know, is dependent on what happens with this new stimulus package in the US, but there has been a better response in the US with the stimulus than in Europe. There was better support here, and that has caused our economy to remain stable so far, or, you know, not to decline as much. And in Europe, they're seeing a lot of companies struggling, and that has, you know, huge implications on what we think is going to happen with Europe. It's just, we're seeing very slow growth. And US, we're seeing sort of a rebound, but not as much as we should have. And, you know, really a lot of it depends on if the new stimulus package is passed, or and nothing happens with that. And in China, again, you know, they have responded so much better to the COVID, and we're seeing, you know, much bigger growth there, and they're actually doing much better.
We have a question that's come in from one of the participants. John Ash has asked, and this is for all the panelists, how do you think that the transportation system could adapt to become more resilient to situations like COVID-19 in the future? Do you have any thoughts as to how the freight transportation system, as it relates to the movement of the industries and the products that you guys represent, how it might become more resilient? Who wants to go first? Michelle?
This is Ranie. I would just say that now that we've gone through something like this, I think that the best way to prepare for something is to have an emergency plan, I guess, set up for something like this. And I'm not exactly sure how the transportation system could become more resilient, but definitely by being prepared for something like this. I had an interesting conversation with somebody from WSDA a few months ago, and she said, you know, we honestly started thinking about what a pandemic would look like. So this was even pre-pandemic. So just having a plan and the what ifs in line and what we could potentially do to prepare for it. So that's what I would say.
I echo Ranie. So I just feel that now that we've all gone through this, I am pretty certain that every mode of transportation and every commodity is going to be, you know, prepared. We've had our challenges, and I think with the current situation, that I agree with Ranie that, you know, there's going to be a plan. They'll be prepared for it, and it will be more efficient than this current situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think go ahead, Aleksandra.
Oh yeah, sorry. So yes, I agree. I mean, one of the big things is that the companies were not prepared, the supply chains were not prepared. And I do think I agree with Michelle that now that a lot of companies we've been through this, you know, we are companies are planning to handle supply chains better. And, you know, but still there needs to be a better visibility in what's going on in your own supply chain. And there needs to be a better alternative source planning and better risk management. If you look at the global level, a lot of companies are very, they rely on China heavily. And what happens, you know, when you have certain changes, and what happens if you have a pandemic like this? What happens if the tariff implications are stronger? And there needs to be a plan on, you know, what happens and how can your supply chain shift to the other supplier or the other country? And is that even possible for some companies, or is that even possible globally? Because China has been building up so long and so much to be able to handle a lot of the global demand, especially US demand. So that's globally. But for US, obviously, you know, there needs to be a clear path on how the things are shipped, where they are shipped, and if there is a shift from shipping to restaurants to more consumption at home, there needs to be a way to adjust. And I think, you know, as Michelle pointed out, that you know, the companies should be ready for something like this. There has been a shift. And I know myself, I've been, I subscribed to one online delivery for fruits and vegetables, and they had huge delays, and they still have them. So companies are adapting, and more adoption needs to happen, and there needs to be a shift in where things are shipped from, and how this is all planned for huge demand at home versus demand at restaurants. With railroads, trucking being able to handle better, and what we're seeing a lot is the demand for smaller vans that ship e-commerce goods.
So, I mean, I certainly think that the fact that no one was really prepared for COVID, I think that's not surprising, since it's not often that we have a global impact like that. I mean, our transportation system, our supply chains certainly deal with periodic kind of site-specific geographic disruptions, whether those be weather-related, hurricanes, earthquakes, things that impact those supply chains. But something like COVID that was global in nature and affected all places on the earth is a little bit different in terms of planning for something like that, and unpredicted. We have another question from someone on the participants it's somewhat related to what I had asked earlier, talking about, given people's changes in how they consume their food, meaning more going to the grocery store, preparing their foods at home, less eating out, less eating at restaurants. What do the panelists believe are going to be kind of the longer term implications to the ag and food industry as it relates to changing consumer preferences, choosing to prepare their foods at home instead of eating out more often? Ranie, want to take a stab at that one?
Oh boy, that one caught me. Michelle, do you have any thoughts on that first? I guess I think there's going to be just a lot more planning, and people are going to really get educated on what they're eating regarding ag, like fresh fruits and vegetables and such. And I think they're going to be doing a lot. I know I'm speaking for myself. I've done lots of prep work at home or consumption at home, and clearly I have to, but I think that people are going to be doing a lot more planning for that and really taking time. And I think that there's going to be domestically, we're going to see a bump in eating, people just going to the grocery store and not eating out as often as they were before. So that's just my 2 cents.
I'm on a little different level. I think it's a cycle. I think we'll cycle back around where we will be eating out with restaurants. I think we need to get there. I don't know how long that's going to take. I feel really bad for restaurants now that, all the restrictions, but I do know people like to go out and socialize. It's just, how scared are people going to be? You might see different age groups. We see it now. And so to prepare for that, or what is changed, I agree with Ranie. We're just going to have to adjust to the times, and we've adjusted before, but like for wheat, we feed the world. So we are a big exporter, and so we closely monitor. They do a lot of home baked breads, those types of things. They use our flour for their desserts. So it's not all. It'll be a change, but we should be able, hopefully, to accommodate it. But I do see it cycling back around where we'll be out again. So.
That's good. Aleksandra, you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, we worked on a paper, or it's a free paper, really. I can share it with you guys too. But basically, this was done sometimes in May or June with our agribusiness group, and we sort of looked at the changes to the food and ag supply chain industry, and basically covered what we think is happening and what we think will happen in the short term. What we were seeing then, and what what I see now is that sometimes, and again, May or June, we may see shift back to restaurant eating, and slowly recover, but we do see recovery. but currently, the short term, there has been a dislocation as much as 25% in some geographic areas with this increase of eating from home and food being shipped directly to customer versus to restaurants. I do think that, short-term implications are maybe, year away, and, and like hopefully next year in summer, we'll be back to where we were, but those changes have happened and the supply chain has adapted and is adapting still. And we think that, sometimes next year, this will turn around again.
I think you also see an adjustment to change because you see people order groceries from their home and pick up, there's those types of changes. So
Yeah.
People are adapting the way they need to. So, I mean, they still have to eat. And so I think that there just may be different ways that they do that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the industry, of course, change is always with us. And I think in the restaurant industry, the ones that have at least done well are those that can continue to operate, have carry-out options, but can take a menu and make it good as a carry-out option, and so that or seating outside, or at least space them in places where they can spread them out. And so restaurants are adapting, and I kind of agree with what Michelle was saying, is that there is a desire. People do like to go out and eat periodically. It may not be a long-term kind of like a permanent change in terms of the way we do things, but I do feel like things are at some point will kind of swing back in terms of eating out in restaurants more. I don't see any other questions queued up on our Q&A or in the channel or in the chat either, and so I'd like to take this time to thank the panelists for participating and bringing your industry-specific knowledge. I think that's very helpful to understand how specific industries, and in this case, industries that are very important to the Pacific Northwest economy, just understanding how those industries have been impacted. I think the common themes that we heard today was certainly things related to labor impacts. Of course, they impacted the grain industry and the tree fruit industry differently. Things impacting our freight supply chains certainly affected all of us, or all of those different industries. Export markets, it impacted it, and even domestic consumption. And I think based upon what we're hearing from IHS Markit, the expectations going forward are that GDP is going to come back, and at some point it may not be exactly like it was before COVID-19, but it's going to be the new reality that we all have to live with. And so I want to thank the panelists. I appreciate you being here and taking the time and sharing your expertise and knowledge. And with that, I think we'll draw this session to a close. Any other questions or comments that the panelists would like to make? If not, thanks for coming, and we will end this panel session.